Let's see, we're going to be in the Gospel of Matthew. The title of the sermon is The Women Who Saw It All. The Women Who Saw It All, and we're going to look at Matthew 27, verse 57, all the way through Matthew chapter 28 and verse 10. And I'll tell you what to watch for. At first, this section of text looks like an apologetic on Matthew's part. An apologetic is a proof text. And from the language of what we're going to look at, it looks like the middle verses, it looks like the verses 62 to about 66 seems like, when we read this, kind of the main part of the apologetic. He's making sure, now keep in mind that Matthew's audience is reading in 85 AD. It's after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and the most prominent heresy or the most prominent anti-Christian argument that was going on at that time was that Jesus didn't really resurrect from the dead, but that somebody had come and stolen his body. And you get there by looking at the text that I shared with you there. And so it looks like this is an apologetic, and the main part, like I said, verses 62 through 66, he makes sure that his reader realizes there is no way somebody could have stole the body. But then, if we pay closer attention, and it looks like scattered throughout this text, as well as our previous pericope, Matthew is doing something that looks kind of strange at first. As a footnote to each of the pericopes, he's casually noting, and the women who were there saw it. If we look back at the last one that we had a few weeks ago, back in verse, where was it? Verse 55, he just happens to casually say, and there were some women there who saw it. And then in our text today, once or twice, it looks like he says, and there were some women there that saw it. And upon closer inspection, we learn that that actually is one of the main thrusts of the pericope that we're looking at today, is Matthew is going to disarm every argument against the actual death, burial, and resurrection of Christ through the eyewitness testimony of these women that he keeps constantly repeating the phrase, they were there and they saw it. So that's the two aspects of the sermon. Let's jump into verse 62 first, and then we'll look at the women who saw it. So verse 62, the next day, that is the day after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate. They said, "Sir, we remembered how that impostor said while he was still alive, that after 3 days I will rise. Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people that he is risen from the dead, and the last fraud will be worse than the first." Verse 65, and then Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go make it as secure as you can." I would put a square around those words. Make it as secure as you can. Verse 66, so they went and they made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. So first of all, it looks like the chief priests and the elders had been paying attention to at least some of Jesus' teaching. We've made it clear from past sermons that Jesus, all throughout the Gospel of Matthew, is making it clear to the chief priests and the elders and the Pharisees, your time is up. You guys are about to get kicked out, and brand new people are going to be ushered in. When Jesus told a parable that said that the people that the vineyard owner left the vineyard to weren't doing their job. So the vineyard owner sends his son to tell them to get with the program, and rather than listen to the son, they see killing the son as their opportunity to take over the whole operation. And at the end of that parable, it says, and the Pharisees perceived that he was talking about them. You guys are the ones that are about to kill the son, believing that if you get rid of me, you guys will be able to have the run of the land. You guys will be able to take over the kingdom. And he says, what do you think the father of that son is going to do to those people when he comes? And they know what's going to happen. He's going to put them to a miserable death. So it's been no hidden secret that Christ Jesus had come to displace the current power structure, the current hierarchy, the current aristocracy of first century Greco-Roman Jerusalem. Because of that, they wanted to kill him. Now that they've killed him, they remember his words. Let me take you back to Matthew chapter 12 and verse 38. Some of the scribes and the Pharisees said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." And Jesus replied, a wicked and adulterous generation demands a sign, but none will be given to it except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. Verse 40, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And they recognize we better do something to make sure that there's no possible resurrection after these 3 days. So they go to Pilate and they tell him, will you let us borrow some power? Will you let us borrow some intimidation and some authority so that nobody can get in or out of that tomb? And Pilate says, go ahead, take a guard, make it as secure as you know how to. So the chief priests here, one of the pictures that Jesus is painting for his disciples in 85 AD, 55 years after the resurrection, he's saying, hey, get this part straight. The Pharisees anticipated someone trying to come steal the body. And so they did everything in their power to make sure that that couldn't happen. They had the Roman guards come. They had them seal the stone. This is one of our first examples of eminent domain. Do we know what eminent domain is? Nobody likes it. So when the government comes in and all of a sudden they say, hey, this was your property yesterday, but starting at now, this is now my property. And if you trespass, the full weight of the law will come against you. The full wrath of your government will be breaking down your door around 4 o'clock in the morning. So that's what happens here. Eminent domain, the right of a government or its agent to expropriate, take away private property. So that's what we see the guards, that's what we see Rome doing here. They go to this private man's tomb. They put a seal on it saying this is Roman property. Anybody enters here on threat of death. The second thing that I think needs to be drawn out of the text is your translation probably has Pilate saying, you have a guard. I'd put a square around that word, guard. Because Pilate saying you have a guard makes it sound like you've got one soldier. But notice in the text, he follows it up with, you will have a guard of soldiers. So right away, we know that this term is plural. In the original language, the word guard is plural. It's all plural, so you'd have no problem. But we want to bring clarity. And we know specifically that in the original language, what is translated, you have a guard, is actually the word custodian. Where is it? I thought I gave it to you. You have a custodian. Well, the Green Berets, our own army, has some of the handbooks from Rome, and we know what a Roman custodian was, and we know how it worked, and it was the playbook for our very own Green Berets. A Roman custodian was 4 groups of 4 soldiers, 16 soldiers in total. Each one of these soldiers, like a Green Beret, was a master of 5 different instruments of death, weapons that could kill someone. And these guys were trained to defend 6 square feet of land that nobody could get past them. And you put 4 rows of 16 of these guys, and you can for sure bet nobody was going to get through that. So you've got the Roman seal, and you've got this Roman custodian. You also had Pilate giving the chief priests full access, make it as secure as you know how, and as much as the chief priests and elders want to stop this charade from going any further, we also know that they had 200 temple police of their own. So it's very well likely, in addition to these Roman custodian, they could have used some of their own temple police. And you might think, well, that sounds like overkill, Tony. Would they really put 200 or 300 people to guard the tomb? Well, let's remember that it was a centurion of soldiers that went out to get Jesus when he was in the garden. A centurion of soldiers was 600 soldiers. That shouldn't surprise us, because there were 500 soldiers that took Paul to jail. So it shouldn't surprise us that that kind of force is being used. So from Matthew giving us such a detailed description that we extrapolate from that, your normal theologian will read into that and go, this is Matthew's attempt for his audience to make an apologetic that there was no way anybody was getting into or out of that tomb. It would have been humanly impossible. Well, that's one apologetic, but the one that surprises me the most is realizing that when Matthew talks about, and the women were there, it seems like just a footnote, like something you could read past without much significance. But if we pay attention, we find out that Matthew says that 4 different times in the pericope. And inquiring minds want to know, why would Matthew keep saying, and these women were there and they saw it? So let's explore that. Number 1, let's go back to verse 54. This is the first time Matthew gives us this footnote about women watching. This first footnote is going to be the reality that the women saw the crucifixion. Let's read it, verse 54. When the centurion and those who were with him kept watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe, and they said, truly, this was the Son of God. Verse 55. And there were also many women there, looking on from a distance, who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, amongst whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the other Mary, the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Some of the things that we pick up from the text are these women that just happen to keep showing up in Matthew's narrative. He says these were the women who had followed Jesus here from Galilee because they were diakonos. Diakonos means servants. These were ministers of Jesus. These were women that had been following Jesus throughout his ministry in Galilee, paying for his ministry, providing support for his ministry, doing anything they could to be ministers, servants of Jesus during his ministry. So the picture that paints for us is these women that Matthew is talking about were intimately familiar with Jesus. They had been with the man his entire ministry in Galilee. They know the guy. They know what he looks like. They know the sound of his voice. They recognize his sermons and his parables. They were intimately familiar with Jesus. They have come with Jesus all the way from Galilee. And Matthew puts them here and says, here they are, near the cross, where they could see everything that was happening. They saw the man that they were intimately familiar with laid on the cross, nailed to it, and then raised up into the air. And they heard these soldiers. They saw the omens, the darkness of the land, the earthquakes, rocks breaking open, and they heard the soldiers confess, surely he was the Christ. So in this text, he says these women who were intimately familiar with Jesus witnessed the definite crucifixion and the sure death of Jesus. No one can say some of the other heresies or arguments that were floating around later on, we know especially from Islam, one of them was that it wasn't actually Jesus who got nailed to the cross, it was someone that looked like him. And that's one of the purposes, one of the apologetics. No, Matthew says you can't get away with that argument because the women who knew him were there. They saw him. They didn't make any mistake. And what else did they see? John chapter 19 gives us another description about what happened. Verse 33, but they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water flowed out. He was already dead before they ever put the spear in his side. And Matthew says these same women that followed him from Galilee saw the whole thing. I'm going to put a pin in the sermon right there. I'm going to deviate just a little bit, but no one can make the argument, maybe he didn't die. Maybe he just fainted and they took him off the cross, but he didn't really die. And the testimony here says that's not a possible argument. They saw him die, the soldiers saw him die, and he was already dead when they stuck the spear in his side. So you can't argue that, but just for a more recent, more modern attestation to the death of Jesus on the cross, there is this journal. My understanding, it's the most respected medical journal that we have. It's called the JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And they chose to investigate the crucifixion of Jesus. This is from 1986. And here is what the Journal of the American Medical Association concluded about the crucifixion. Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear thrust between his right ribs and probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and the heart, and thereby ensured his death. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. So they witnessed his death, they witnessed his crucifixion. But that's not all. These same women get referred to again down in verse 57. Number 2, these same women are going to be there when Jesus gets buried in the tomb. Verse 57. And when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and he asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him, and Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud. Verse 60, and laid him in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock, and he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb, and then he went away. And then there's a footnote. Verse 61, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the tomb. I'm just tickled by that because it doesn't seem very significant the first time he said it at the crucifixion. The two Marys were there and saw it. You don't know what to make of that. Here we see it again. Now he lays the dead body of Jesus in the tomb. Footnote, the two Marys were at the tomb and they saw him laid in the tomb. And they saw the stone rolled in front of the tomb. They're testifying to the second great claim of the gospel. The claim of the gospel is he died, he was buried, and he was resurrected. And so far, these two women are being noted by Matthew as having witnessed the death and crucifixion and the burial. So by this point, we may start realizing, hey, maybe these ladies aren't just a footnote. Maybe they are the focus of the pericope. They are the apologetic for anybody that would have any kind of argument denying any one of the realities of the crucifixion, the death, the burial, or the resurrection. Let's look at the third one. Number 3. These same women are going to see the angel and the empty tomb. Chapter 28 and verse 1. Now after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, and he came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. Verse 5. But the angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he has said. Come, see the place where he laid. Ask yourself, what did the women get to see here? Not only an angel come down from heaven, and typical Old Testament language of transcendent, divine, angelic beings is white as snow, dressed in clothing white as snow. Not only do they see that, but they see the guards, these 16 war machine green berets, fall to the ground terrified, looking as though they had died. Something massive happened here. And the only people to see it were the guards and these two ladies. It could have been more, ladies, but he keeps saying Mary and the other Mary. Massive implications to that. Then they're invited in to inspect the empty tomb. Let me put a pin in the sermon there. And I keep telling you guys that I'm supposedly working on a book. All the historical data for the resurrection of Christ. Let me share with you a little bit of what's in there regarding this section of the women being here at the empty tomb. Part of what gets documented, not just in the Bible, but in Roman history. Not only are these women in the Bible attesting to the resurrection, but there are Roman historians that have written about this moment, attesting to it as well. I want to share that with you, but let me help you understand what exactly is happening. Let's go to John chapter 20. We just read that he said, go in and inspect the tomb, and then go back and tell all the disciples what you've seen. So just before John chapter 20, when we start reading here, these ladies have gone back to the disciples and said, the tomb is empty. He's been resurrected. Says that the disciples didn't believe her, but there were two particular disciples that decided to run to the tomb. Peter and John, the apostle Jesus loved. It's funny because John is writing this, and he doesn't give you his name, but John says Peter and the other apostle ran to the tomb, and the other apostle beat Peter. So he doesn't say, I beat Peter. He just says the other apostle, he's being humble. So John beats Peter to the tomb. John sees the tomb first, notices something interesting inside. Peter comes, sees the tomb second. He notices something inside the tomb as well. That's going to be important to our study. So let's read it, guys. John chapter 20 and verse 4. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter, and he reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there. But he did not go in. Verse 6, then Simon Peter came, following him, and he went right into the tomb. And he saw the linen cloths lying there. And the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, was not lying with the linen cloths, but was folded up in a place by itself. And then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw it. What was the result of these apostles seeing the burial cloths still in the tomb? They believed. They believed in the resurrection. Let me put a pin in a sermon right there. You guys have heard of this Shroud of Turin? Who's heard of it before? They have this shroud, I think it's at the Vatican, and they claim that it's the shroud that Jesus was buried in. Let me just share with you one reason I have a problem with it. I don't think it's real. It's one solid sheet that has the entire body and the head of Jesus on this one solid sheet. If you look at the text that we just read, can you see a problem with that? Jesus was buried with linens around his body, but a different cloth was used around his head. It wasn't one in the same cloth. That's just for inquiring minds. So let's look at this. The linen cloths were still there, but the cloth that was around his head was folded up in a place by itself. Very strange details, and very strange that God saw fit that the resurrected Jesus would first Fold his clothes? So here may be why that was. That might be an apologetic to prove arguments against the resurrection false. Let me show you what some of these Roman historians have written. Here's one commentary that refers to an ancient Coptic fragment. As soon as he said Coptic fragment, I knew this was out of my pay grade. But let's let a smart guy tell you what it is. Most scholars think that the very presence of the burial clothes in the tomb led the beloved disciple, that's John, to conclude that the body had not been stolen. Grave robbers would not have taken the time to unwrap the body, thus giving themselves the burden of carrying a stiff, naked corpse. Grass, in page 55, cites a Coptic apocryphal fragment wherein Pilate is called by the Jewish authorities to see the tomb from which the body had been stolen. But when he sees the burial clothes, he observes that if the body had been taken away, stolen, then the wrappings would have been taken with it. Sometimes we don't know why certain things were done the way they were done. Why would God see fit to fold the clothes? Until later on we begin seeing the wisdom that is an apologetic to say, no, nobody came and stole the body, because there was 70 pounds of expensive fragrant spices that not embalmed, but were laid on the body with the burial clothes. If you were a grave robber, are you going to take a rotted corpse out of the wrappings and just carry the falling apart skeleton in your hands? Nobody would consider doing that. That's what would have had to happen. And so Pilate, it is testified in a fragment that Pilate went to go see it. And Pilate said, the Jews are lying. His body wasn't stolen because thieves would not have left the burial clothes behind. There's another bit of information. It'll be in the book. But there is 2 letters that we have copies of. Again, it's out of my pay grade. I don't know how to verify them, but they're in England somewhere. And it's a letter from Pilate to Tiberius that every so often the local governor was required to send news back to Rome, back to Tiberius the Caesar, about different things that were happening. And of course, Pilate wrote Tiberius about the resurrection and the burial clothes being left behind. That's documented. It is also documented that Tiberius Caesar, the Roman Caesar who was the Caesar at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, after he hears Pilate's report about the resurrection, Tiberius Caesar wants to deify Jesus of Nazareth. Tiberius, the Caesar of Rome, wants to make Jesus a Roman god. Did he? No, because he had to present it to the Senate in Rome. The Senate was the only one who could deify a person. So the Senate didn't allow him. Fascinating stuff. It's the kind of thing that skeptics don't want to admit is real. One other fragment that we have found by a guy named Chrysostom, if anyone had removed the body, he would not have stripped it first, nor would he have taken the trouble to remove and roll up the salvarium and put it in a place by itself. Multiple historical figures, non-biblical historical figures. Number 4, the women show up again. Number 4, not only did the women get to see this stuff but the women actually grab a hold of the resurrected Jesus. Verse 9, chapter 28 and verse 9. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came up and they took hold of his feet and they worshiped him. And Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." This is the kind of story that you want to mull over like cattle do when they're sitting in the shade. You want to chew the cud. Sit in a hammock somewhere and recognize all these little footnotes about, and the two Marys happen to be there. Two Marys that were intimately familiar with Jesus, supported his ministry, ate with him, knew his sermons, knew his parables, traveled to Jerusalem with him, saw the right guy crucified, not a stranger, saw him dead, not just fainted, saw him put into a tomb who was heavily protected by 16 Roman Green Berets and possibly 200 Jewish soldiers. They saw that. They were sitting there. They saw the angel come down out of heaven. They saw the angel roll the tomb away. They saw the soldiers faint. They saw the tomb empty. And then they saw the man that they had been supporting his ministry resurrected from the dead, and they grabbed a hold of him. Boy, there is nothing that an antagonist could suppose happened that this account, these little footnotes of these ladies seeing it, there is no antagonist, no argument that could hold water because of what these two women witnessed with their own eyes. And I think that's what Matthew was doing, creating an apologetic so that his own audience could not have any argument against the reality of the death, the burial, or the resurrection from the dead. The women who seem like only a footnote actually play a major role in apologetics. I'm fascinated by that. Let's put a pause right there, guys. I hope that was interesting.